What if one small, selfless act could unravel the threads of your entire life, weaving them into a tapestry of unimaginable opportunity? Imagine this: a struggling mechanic, teetering on the edge of giving up, crosses paths with a child whose broken dreams are as tangible as the shattered wheelchair beneath him. This is the story of Ethan Brooks, a humble mechanic in a forgotten town, whose quiet kindness toward a boy named Caleb ignites a chain reaction that leads to a private jet, a life-altering offer, and a future he never dared to dream of. Stay tuned, because this tale will remind you that the smallest gestures can spark the greatest changes. The late afternoon sun bathed the cracked pavement outside Ethan's garage in a soft, amber glow, but the warmth couldn't erase the heartbreaking sight that stopped him in his tracks. A boy, no older than 9, sat motionless just beyond the entrance, his small frame trembling as silent tears carved paths down his dirt-streaked cheeks. His wheelchair, a battered relic of better days, leaned awkwardly to one side, its front wheel twisted into a jagged, unusable mess. One of the boy's hands gripped the armrest with white-knuckled desperation, while the other swiped at his eyes, frustration etched into every movement. Ethan, a wrench still dangling from his calloused fingers, felt the boy's quiet despair pierce through the usual hum of his sleepy town shop. Beside the child stood a woman, his mother, Ethan assumed, her face a map of exhaustion and helplessness as she knelt to whisper words of comfort, only for the boy to turn away, shame shadowing his young features. The pain in his eyes wasn't just from the broken chair. It was the kind of hurt that comes from feeling trapped, invisible, left behind. Now, put yourself in Ethan's shoes. You're barely scraping by, your shop on the brink of closing, and you see this boy's world crumbling before you. What would you do next? Would you walk over, offer a kind word, and promise to fix the chair, even if it means working late into the night? Or would you hesitate, unsure if you can afford to help, and risk letting the boy and his mother walk away, still broken? Let us know in the comments. Choose option 1 or 2, and share your thoughts. And if stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories for more tales of hope and humanity. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Every single subscription means the world to us. We're working hard to share powerful, real-life stories that inspire hope, courage, and kindness. Getting to 1,000 subscribers is a huge milestone, and your support truly keeps us going. Thank you for being part of this journey. You're not just a viewer, you're family. Ethan didn't hesitate. He set down the wrench, wiped his grease-stained hands on his faded overalls, and approached the boy with a steady, unhurried stride. Kneeling beside him, he offered a smile that seemed to cut through the heavy air like a ray of sunlight. "Hey, little man," he said, his voice as warm and steady as the purr of a well-tuned engine. "Looks like you've hit a rough patch, huh?" The boy, Caleb, glanced up, his eyes still shimmering with unshed tears, his lower lip quivering. He nodded silently, gesturing toward the mangled wheel with a helpless wave. "I was just trying to roll down the sidewalk, and it hit something," he mumbled, his voice breaking as he trailed off. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the twisted spokes and warped metal, assessing the damage with a mechanic's precision. Standing, he turned to the woman, Lydia, Caleb's mother, whose tired eyes and disheveled hair spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. Her jacket was threadbare, the cuffs frayed, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a worn purse. "I can take a look at it," Ethan said, his tone firm but kind. "No charge." Lydia's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "Are you sure?" I don't have much." Ethan raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's all right. I insist." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken gratitude. Then Lydia nodded, her voice a whisper. "Thank you." The air in the garage seemed to shift, as if the weight of their shared vulnerability had carved out a small sanctuary amidst the clutter of tools and oil cans. Ethan could feel the gravity of the moment, not just in Caleb's tear-streaked face, but in the way Lydia's shoulders slumped, as if she'd been carrying the world for far too long. He saw in her the same quiet resilience he'd seen in his own mother years ago, when she'd worked double shifts to keep the lights on after his father's passing. That memory stirred something deep within him, a resolve to be the kind of man who didn't just fix things, but who lifted burdens, even if just for a moment. Ethan gently lifted the wheelchair and rolled it into the garage, unaware that this simple act of kindness was about to unravel the fabric of his life. Lydia followed closely, her gaze darting between her son and the man now crouching beside a cluttered workbench, her eyes glistening with a mix of hope and disbelief. Acts of generosity like this were rare in their world, where cold stares and turned backs were far more common than open hearts. Caleb perched on an overturned crate just inside the doorway, watching Ethan with wide, curious eyes as he examined the chair like it was a vintage car in need of a tune-up. Ethan's fingers moved with the ease of years of practice, flipping levers, spinning wheels, gently tugging at bent joints. Caleb's expression softened, a spark of wonder igniting in his gaze, not just because someone was helping, but because for the first time in weeks, someone was truly seeing him. Lydia stood silently for a moment, then stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect this. Most people, they just look away." Ethan didn't look up, but a faint smile tugged at his lips as he grunted softly. "Well, I'm not most people." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the shop floor. Inside, something far greater was taking shape, a connection forged not just through metal and tools, but through the quiet power of compassion. Ethan rolled the wheelchair onto a pair of weathered wooden ramps he usually used for motorcycle repairs. Kneeling to inspect the damage, he saw the full extent of the problem. The front caster was bent inward at a brutal angle, its bearings cracked and shattered as if it had slammed into a curb at full speed. The metal frame was slightly warped, likely from months of strain, and one of the brake cables had frayed to a single thread. To most, it would have looked like a lost cause. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw with a grease-slicked hand. This wasn't a quick fix. It would take hours, parts he didn't have, and patience he couldn't always spare. His shop had been teetering on the edge of collapse. The phone hadn't rung with a new job in weeks, and the stack of unpaid bills on his desk grew taller by the day. But none of that mattered now. He glanced over his shoulder at Caleb, whose legs dangled from the crate, swinging slowly as he watched with unblinking hope. That look, it reminded Ethan of a memory he'd buried deep, a time when he was a boy, standing in this very garage after his father's death, needing someone to care enough to stay. The air in the garage felt thick with the ghosts of that moment, the faint scent of his father's cologne, the echo of his laughter as he'd taught Ethan how to hold a wrench. Ethan could almost hear his father's voice now, low and steady. "Fix what you can, son. The rest will sort itself out." That memory wrapped around him like a worn blanket, grounding him in the present. He turned back to the wheelchair, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about a chair. It was about giving Caleb the kind of moment Ethan had once needed, a moment where someone showed up when the world seemed to have walked away. Ethan's mind drifted to that day, 20 years ago, when he'd stood in the same spot Caleb now occupied, his father's toolbox at his feet. The bank had come for the shop after his father's passing, and Ethan, barely 14, had begged the man in the suit not to take it. "This is all I have left of him," he'd pleaded, his voice cracking. The man had walked away, unmoved, leaving Ethan with a hollow ache that never quite faded. He remembered the cold bite of that winter morning, the way the frost had clung to the garage windows, and the weight of his mother's hand on his shoulder as she whispered, "We'll figure it out, Ethan." They had. Barely, but the fear of losing everything had never left him. Now, looking at Caleb, he saw that same desperation, that same need for someone to fight for him. Ethan turned back to the wheelchair, his jaw tightening with resolve. "Not this time," he murmured to himself. "I won't let this kid feel that kind of loss." Ethan rummaged through the back corner of his garage, where forgotten parts lay buried under layers of dust and memory. The air back there was stale, heavy with the scent of rust and old oil, and the dim light cast eerie shadows across the cluttered shelves. Beneath a pile of rusted chains and dented toolboxes, he found a cracked but sturdy bicycle frame he'd meant to scrap months ago. He ran his fingers along the metal, envisioning how it could be transformed into something more meaningful. The frame was scratched and faded, its once bright red paint peeling away, but it felt solid in his hands, like a promise waiting to be kept. Hauling it onto the workbench, he clamped it in place and began cutting. sparks flying from the rotary saw as he shaped the piece with meticulous care, measuring, grinding, adjusting. The sharp scent of burning metal filled the air, and the hum of the saw drowned out the world outside. He fabricated a new front fork, custom welded to fit the wheelchair's frame, reinforcing it with extra bracing. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong, far sturdier than the original. The hours slipped away unnoticed. Outside, the sky turned from amber to purple to inky black, the stars peeking through the garage's high windows like silent witnesses. Caleb had fallen asleep against the wall, a hoodie bundled under his head, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of innocent dreams. Lydia scrolled her phone nearby, occasionally glancing up with a mix of curiosity and gratitude, her fingers tapping nervously against the cracked screen. Ethan worked in silence, but the care in every bolt he tightened, every weld he smoothed, spoke louder than words. His hands moved with a rhythm born of years of practice, but his mind was elsewhere, on Caleb's tearful eyes, on the way Lydia's voice had trembled with hope, on the memory of his own father's hands guiding his own over a similar workbench. For him, this wasn't just about fixing a chair. It was about mending something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in time or money. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, Ethan looked down at his work and allowed himself a quiet smile. He hadn't just repaired the damage. He'd reimagined the entire design. When he finally rolled the finished chair out into the open garage bay, the soft hum of the caster wheels broke the stillness. Caleb stirred from his nap, blinking at the newly restored frame before him, his jaw dropping in awe. The chair didn't just look fixed, it looked transformed. Reinforced wheels, a smoother seat alignment, and dual-functioning brakes that had never worked properly before. You made it better," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling with wonder. Ethan shrugged, trying to downplay his effort. "Just made a few tweaks. Should roll a lot smoother now." Lydia stood behind her son, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes glistening as if she were witnessing a miracle. And perhaps, for them, it was. She helped Caleb climb back into the seat, adjusting the straps with trembling fingers. Caleb pushed the wheels forward, and the chair glided effortlessly. His face lit up with a joy so pure it seemed to fill the air like a melody. He did a full turn, then another, gliding across the pavement with a freedom he hadn't felt in months. "It works. It's better than before." Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching in silence. In that moment, he didn't need thanks. The light in Caleb's eyes was more than enough. But as Caleb spun in circles, laughing with a brightness that seemed to chase away the shadows of the garage, Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It was a mix of pride and longing, a bittersweet ache that reminded him of all the things he'd never had the chance to fix: his father's absence, his mother's exhaustion, the dreams he'd buried under the weight of keeping the garage alive. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the boy before him. But the feeling lingered, a quiet whisper of what might be possible if he dared to dream bigger. 2 days passed quietly. Ethan returned to his routine, tuning carburetors, changing oil, patching up old pickups that had seen better decades. The garage was calm that evening, golden light spilling through the high windows as he wiped his hands on a rag, ready to lock up for the night. The air smelled of motor oil and metal, a familiar comfort that had always grounded him. He reached for the light switch when a deep, unfamiliar sound rolled through the sky, a low, vibrating rumble that shook the old metal walls. Ethan froze. It wasn't thunder, nor a truck. It was something heavier, faster, more deliberate. Stepping outside, he shaded his eyes against the setting sun. In the distance, beyond the cornfields and the dusty town limits, a sleek silver object sliced through the sky, polished and purposeful. A private jet. His brow furrowed. No one in town owned a jet. No one in 3 towns over could even dream of such a thing. The closest thing to luxury here was the diner's Friday night pie special. Yet there it was, descending with precision toward the tiny airstrip on the outskirts of town. Ethan's chest tightened, a strange unease settling in his gut. Something was coming, and it had everything to do with him. Ethan stood at the edge of his garage, arms crossed, watching the jet glide to a gentle landing on the rural airstrip. The engines hissed as they powered down, sending up a soft cloud of dust that swirled in the fading sunlight. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence was unnerving, like the stillness before a storm. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Who could this be? What did they want with a place like this? He thought of Caleb and Lydia, wondering if they were somehow connected, but the pieces didn't fit. Then, from behind a hangar, a sleek black sedan emerged, its glossy finish reflecting the colors of the sunset as it rolled down the narrow road leading straight toward town, straight toward him. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He wiped his hands on his overalls, glancing around as if someone else might step forward to claim this moment. But there was no one, just the whisper of the wind, the crunch of gravel under tires, and the growing hum of uncertainty in his mind. The sedan slowed as it neared the garage, stopping right in front of his shop. The engine cut out, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the sedan, its tinted windows giving nothing away. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the life he'd built in this small town was about to be upended by forces he couldn't control. The air felt charged, heavy with the weight of the unknown, and for a fleeting moment, he considered turning back inside, locking the door, and pretending he hadn't seen a thing. But something held him there, a curiosity, a hope, a fear that whatever was coming might be the answer to questions he hadn't even known to ask. The back door of the sedan opened with a smooth click, and a tall man in a sharply tailored suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with casual precision. His shoes gleamed like mirrors as he scanned the garage, his gaze locking onto Ethan. "Ethan Brooks?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. Ethan hesitated, his throat dry. "Yeah, that's me." The man offered a measured nod. "My name is Victor Hayes. I represent Mr. Conrad Ellison." He gestured toward the car, and a second figure emerged, older, composed, with silver hair and an aura that radiated wealth and authority. "May we have a word?" Victor asked. Ethan's mind raced. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of something far greater. Ethan stood frozen as the older man approached, his steps deliberate, carrying the weight of something monumental. Conrad Ellison. The name didn't ring a bell, but there was something about him, the way he moved, the way even the dust seemed to part for him. He wasn't just rich, he was powerful. Ethan instinctively wiped his palms on his overalls, suddenly aware of the grease smudges on his face and the dirt under his nails. This man belonged in a boardroom, not in a rundown garage in a town most maps forgot. Conrad stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes scanning the garage before landing on Ethan. He didn't smile, but there was a depth in his gaze, something knowing. 2 days ago, Conrad said, his voice low and steady, "You repaired a wheelchair for a young boy outside this very shop." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Conrad took a step closer. "That boy is my grandson." The words hit Ethan like a thunderclap. His mind scrambled to piece it together. The exhausted mother, the broken chair, the quiet gratitude, and suddenly, it all made sense. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Victor stepped forward, his tone formal. "Mr. Ellison has an opportunity for you, Mr. Brooks. One that could change everything." Ethan swallowed hard, his heart pounding. Something told him his world was about to shift in ways he couldn't yet fathom. He glanced back at the garage, at the familiar chaos of tools and parts, and felt a pang of fear. What if this opportunity meant leaving behind everything he'd ever known? But then he thought of Caleb, of the joy on his face as he'd spun in that chair, and a flicker of hope ignited within him. Maybe this was a chance to do more, to be more, to make a difference on a scale he'd never imagined. For a long moment, Ethan could only stare. The man before him, a billionaire, a figure from a world so far removed from his own, was tied to Caleb, the boy with the crooked smile and fierce determination. Conrad studied Ethan's reaction, then continued, his voice softening with a rare warmth. "My daughter told me everything. How you refused payment, how you worked late into the night with nothing but scraps to not only fix the chair, but make it better. You didn't have to do that." Ethan shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck. It didn't feel right, letting a kid like that go without help. "I didn't think much of it. But I did," Conrad said quietly. "You didn't just repair a wheelchair. You gave a boy back his independence, his dignity." Ethan looked away, unsure how to handle the praise. He'd grown up in a world where respect was earned through actions, not words. "I've seen people spend millions and never make that kind of impact," Conrad added, his tone sincere, almost reverent. "And you did it with an old bike frame and a heart full of care." For the first time, Ethan began to realize that his small act might have rippled further than he'd imagined. Conrad gave a small nod to Victor, who stepped forward with the same calm precision he'd shown from the start. From the inner pocket of his coat, Victor pulled out a sleek black envelope, thick and glossy, and extended it toward Ethan like it held something sacred. "This," Conrad said, "is an opportunity." Ethan stared at the envelope, hesitant to even touch it. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a thank you note, a small token, but the weight in Victor's hand, the tension in the air, hinted at something far greater. With slow, uncertain fingers, Ethan took the envelope and opened the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, cream-colored and edged in silver. His eyes scanned the contents, his brain struggling to process the words. It was a contract, a professional, detailed one, and at the bottom, the annual salary listed nearly stole his breath. "Do you want to hire me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just hire you," Conrad replied. "I want you to lead, to help us build something extraordinary, a facility focused on mobility innovation, designing, repairing, transforming lives. Your skills, your instincts, they belong on a much bigger stage." Ethan clutched the envelope, his heart racing. He had stepped into that day as a small-town mechanic. Now, he stood on the edge of something far greater than he'd ever imagined. Ethan sat at the edge of his workbench, the black envelope resting before him like a Pandora's box of possibilities. The hum of the overhead light buzzed faintly, mixing with the creak of the stool beneath him. He read the contract again, tracing each line with calloused fingers, as if the words might become more real under his touch. The position wasn't just a job. It was a leadership role in a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to mobility research and innovation. A team, a laboratory, equipment he'd only seen in trade magazines. It was a world he'd never dared to dream of. The salary alone was more than he'd earned in the last decade combined, with benefits, housing assistance, and medical coverage. The kind of life people in this town only whispered about in envy. And they wanted him. The same man who welded together old lawnmowers and patched up rusted mufflers. A strange mix of disbelief and fear tangled in his chest. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't thinking about what he could fix. He was wondering if he had the courage to fix something far more uncertain, his future. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay on the old cot in the back room of the garage, the contract resting just a few feet away on the workbench, its presence a silent taunt. The words, the numbers, the promises looped in his mind like a relentless clock. He turned onto his side, then his back, staring up at the rafters, tracing the familiar water stain that had spread over the years. This garage was more than a shop. It was his sanctuary, his history. He'd rebuilt it with his own hands after his father's death, every dent in the wall, every oil stain on the floor a chapter in his story. Letting go felt like tearing pages from a book he wasn't ready to finish. A memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. The day he'd nearly lost the garage for good. It was 5 years ago, a brutal winter when the bills had piled higher than the snow outside. A customer had brought in a vintage truck, promising a big payout, only to disappear without paying after Ethan had poured weeks into the restoration. The bank had called the next day, threatening foreclosure. Ethan had sat on this very cot, his father's old wrench in his hand, the cold metal a lifeline to the man who'd taught him everything. "I can't lose this, Dad," he'd whispered into the empty room, his voice breaking. He'd scraped by, barely, but the fear of failure had never left him. Now, staring at the contract, that same fear clawed at him. What if he failed again? What if he didn't belong in that world? But then came Caleb's face, beaming with joy as he spun in that chair, free for the first time in who knows how long. That image struck him harder than any memory of the garage. What if this was more than a job? What if it was a calling? Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd always been the man people came to when something was broken. But what if it was his turn now? What if he had a chance to fix something inside himself? He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of his father's old wrench, still sitting on the workbench where he'd left it all those years ago. The metal was cool against his skin, a silent reminder of the man who'd believed in him, even when Ethan hadn't believed in himself. Maybe, just maybe, This was his chance to honor that belief, to become the man his father had always known he could be. The next afternoon, as Ethan wiped grease from his hands after finishing a brake job, he heard a familiar sound rolling across the driveway, the gentle hum of wheels gliding smoothly over concrete. He turned toward the open garage door, and there was Caleb, beaming from ear to ear as he maneuvered the wheelchair with newfound confidence. "Hey, Ethan," the boy called out, spinning the chair in a playful circle. "It works so good. I barely have to push." Ethan couldn't help but smile. He stepped forward, crouching beside the chair to inspect it out of habit. Everything was still holding up. Tight, smooth, solid. "That's what I like to hear," Ethan said with a grin. "No issues at all." Caleb shook his head enthusiastically. "None. It's better than any chair I've ever had." A moment later, Lydia appeared behind him, holding a to-go cup of coffee in one hand. She offered it to Ethan with a grateful look. "You didn't just fix it," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave him a piece of his life back." Ethan accepted the coffee with a quiet nod, his throat tightening at her words. He didn't know how to respond to that kind of praise. It was easier to fix machines than to accept emotions. But as Caleb zipped around the parking lot like a kid who'd just discovered he could fly, Ethan realized something. This moment, this joy, was why he hadn't said no to the offer yet. Because deep down, he knew he might be able to give that feeling to countless other kids. Lydia stepped beside Ethan, her eyes following her son with a mix of pride and quiet emotion. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds the soft were of wheels and Caleb's occasional bursts of laughter as he discovered all the things he could do now. Things he hadn't done in far too long. "You made that happen," Lydia said finally, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. "He hasn't smiled like that in months." Ethan offered a modest shrug, staring at the ground. "I just fixed what was broken." "No," she said gently, her tone firm. "You saw what was broken. You cared enough to do something when most people would have kept walking." She paused, then looked up at him. "I heard about the offer. Small town, word travels fast." Ethan let out a quiet breath, unsurprised but still uneasy. "Yeah, I'm still thinking it over." Lydia turned toward him, her tone firmer now. "Ethan, I know this place means something to you. I get it. But what they're offering, it's not just about you. It's about every kid like Caleb out there, waiting for someone with your hands and your heart." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. Ethan didn't answer right away, but his silence spoke volumes. Because deep down, he was starting to wonder if staying meant holding back more than just himself. As Caleb continued to glide across the lot, Ethan's mind drifted to the countless other children who might be out there, waiting for someone to see them, to care enough to act. He thought of the kids who didn't have a Lydia to fight for them, who faced the world's indifference alone. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a call, a quiet, insistent pull towards something greater. He glanced at the contract, still sitting on his workbench, and felt a flicker of possibility. Maybe this wasn't just about leaving his past behind. Maybe it was about building a future for others, a future where no child had to feel invisible. Just as Ethan was about to respond, Caleb rolled back toward them, his cheeks flushed with excitement. He stopped beside Ethan and looked up at him, his expression suddenly serious. "If you go," he began, his voice small but steady, "will you still fix my chair if it breaks again?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. All the doubts swirling in his head, the fear, the pull between two lives, faded into the background. He crouched down, meeting Caleb's eyes. "Of course, buddy. Always." Caleb smiled, that innocent trust only a child could give. "Then I think you should go." Lydia watched the exchange, her hand resting gently on her son's shoulder. Ethan felt something shift inside him, quiet but undeniable. Sometimes, the clearest answers come not from grand offers or polished words, but from the smallest voices spoken with the biggest hearts. The following morning, Ethan was back at the garage before the sun had fully risen. He hadn't signed the contract yet, but Caleb's words had loosened a knot in his chest he hadn't realized he was carrying. Mid-morning, the same black sedan pulled into the lot. Victor stepped out, just as composed as the first time, though his demeanor felt less formal now, almost familiar. "I figured you might still have questions," he said, adjusting his sunglasses. "Mr. Ellison thought it might help to see what you'd actually be a part of." Ethan hesitated for a beat, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, I think I need to. The ride out of town was quiet. The landscape changed slowly. Fields gave way to winding roads, then to clean pavement and sharp, modern lines. Finally, they turned down a private lane lined with trimmed hedges and minimalist signage. At the end stood a sprawling facility, glass and steel, elegant and efficient. Inside, people moved with purpose. Engineers hunched over sketches and 3D models. Technicians tested wheelchair prototypes with motion sensors and smart feedback systems. Ethan had never seen anything like it. Victor glanced over at him. This is where you'd be, not just fixing, but innovating. You'd lead a team, build devices that don't just work, but change lives. Ethan stepped inside the main atrium, the sounds of creation echoing around him, and for the first time, he didn't feel out of place. As they walked through the facility, Ethan's senses were overwhelmed by the hum of innovation. The faint whir of machinery, the sharp scent of metal and solder, the soft glow of computer screens displaying intricate designs. He passed a group of engineers debating the merits of a new suspension system, their voices animated with passion, and felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: inspiration. For so long, he'd been focused on survival, on keeping the garage afloat, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to create something truly new, something that could change lives. The thought both thrilled and terrified him, but as he watched a technician adjust a prototype with the same care he'd shown Caleb's chair, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could belong here. Ethan followed Victor through wide, sunlit corridors lined with glass panels revealing labs filled with machines he could barely name. 3D printers etched out frame components with uncanny precision. Programmable shock absorbers were being tested on adjustable terrain models. In one corner, a prototype exoskeleton allowed a paraplegic woman to take measured, assisted steps. Every room buzzed with innovation, and something more: hope. Victor paused by a viewing bay overlooking a high-tech testing course. This facility is one of only 3 like it in the country, he said. And we've never had someone like you. Ethan blinked. Like me? Victor nodded. You don't just understand mechanics, you understand people. What you did for Caleb wasn't just a repair. It was empathy turned into action. That's what we need here. As Ethan watched a group of young engineers excitedly calibrating a new joystick model for children with limited hand mobility, something stirred deep within him. He remembered all the times he'd fixed things because no one else would. All the times someone walked through his garage door with more than just a broken part. They carried hope with them. And now, here he was, being asked to do that on a scale he'd never imagined. He wasn't sure he was ready, but for the first time, he truly wanted to be. Ethan stood by the glass railing, watching a young girl test a motorized wheelchair that adjusted to her posture as she moved. Her smile, uncertain at first, grew broader with each lap around the polished track. He didn't realize Victor had been standing beside him until the man spoke again, his voice quieter now, more personal. You think we chose you because of what you built, Victor said. But that's only part of it. Ethan glanced at him, eyebrows raised. We've interviewed Ivy League engineers, Victor continued. People with resumes as thick as textbooks. But none of them saw what you saw in that boy. None of them felt it the way you did. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. Victor turned to face him fully. We don't just want your hands, Ethan. We want your heart. That's what's missing in places like this. That's what makes the difference. For a moment, Ethan felt something shift again. Not a shove this time, but a quiet pull. Not pressure, but possibility. He looked back down at the girl completing her final lap. Maybe he didn't belong here because of degrees or titles. Maybe he belonged here because he understood. And maybe that was enough. As he stood there, the sounds of the facility fading into the background, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He thought of his father, of the lessons he'd taught him about fixing what he could, and realized that maybe this was what he'd meant all along. Not just fixing machines, but fixing lives, one small act at a time. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood at the entrance of the facility, not as a visitor, but as part of the team. His name now appeared on the staff roster, printed neatly on a blackened silver badge clipped to his shirt. He rubbed his thumb across the surface, as if to confirm it was real. Inside, the energy was electric. Engineers brainstormed over coffee-stained blueprints, Technicians worked on adaptive gear that responded to real-time feedback from users with disabilities. Ethan walked past a workstation where someone was programming a chair that could auto-adjust to uneven ground, terrain he knew too well from back home. But what surprised him most wasn't the tech, it was the people. They weren't just smart, they cared. They listened. And slowly, day by day, Ethan found himself slipping into a rhythm, learning, collaborating, building. His calloused hands adjusted to the precision of high-tech equipment, yet his instincts remained grounded in the practical wisdom forged from years in his dusty garage. He designed a braking system for children with limited grip strength, reimagined footrests for older veterans who struggled with swelling. Every idea was met with open minds and eager hands. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was just fixing broken things. He felt like he was creating something whole, something lasting, something that mattered. This wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. And Ethan Brooks had finally found his place. One crisp morning, as Ethan reviewed a batch of prototype sketches, he heard the soft whir of wheels echoing through the atrium. He looked up, expecting another engineer or a test subject from rehab, but instead, there was Caleb. The boy rolled in confidently, his chair a sleek, custom-built design outfitted with pressure-responsive wheels, ergonomic controls, and a seat molded exactly to his frame. His hair was a little longer now, his smile brighter than ever. Lydia walked just behind him, tears already welling in her eyes. "We wanted to surprise you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan knelt instinctively, placing a hand on the armrest. "How's it feel?" Caleb grinned. "Like I can go anywhere." Ethan nodded, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "That's the idea." Lydia reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "There's one more thing," she said softly. "It's from Caleb." Inside was a handwritten note in shaky but determined print. "Thank you for fixing my old chair, but more than that, thank you for believing in me. You didn't just fix something, you changed my life." Ethan stared at the paper, his chest tight. He looked back at Caleb, who smiled without needing to say anything else. Because the truth was, Ethan didn't just change Caleb's life. Caleb had changed his. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his hand as he read Caleb's words again. They were simple, unpolished, written in a child's careful scrawl, but to him, they meant more than any contract, any title, any paycheck ever could. He looked up and met Lydia's eyes. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The gratitude etched into her expression said it all. This wasn't just about a chair, it was about dignity, about possibility, about a little boy who no longer saw himself as limited because someone had taken the time to see him fully. Ethan reached out and ruffled Caleb's hair, his voice thick with feeling. "You've got places to go, huh?" Caleb nodded. "Everywhere." They both smiled as they turned to leave. Ethan looked around the facility, the glass walls, the buzzing energy, the people creating tools that would change lives. But more than that, he looked inward. He had stepped into this journey thinking he was just a mechanic, someone who fixed what was broken. But now he understood. He was a builder of something far greater, a future, not just for Caleb, but for every person who needed someone to believe in them. This story reminds us that courage and compassion can spark extraordinary change, no matter where we start. Take a moment to reflect. When has a small act of kindness changed your life, or someone else's? Share your story in the comments below using #KindnessMatters, and let's inspire each other to keep the goodness going. As Ethan Brooks walked back to his bench, a fresh idea already forming in his mind, one thing was certain. He hadn't just found a job, he had found his why. Sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the simplest choices, a kind word, a helping hand, or the decision to care when no one else does. Ethan didn't have much. He wasn't wealthy, famous, or powerful, but what he did have was a heart that chose compassion over convenience. And in doing so, he didn't just change a boy's life, he changed his own. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to bringing you tales like this, stories of hope, resilience, and the quiet heroes who remind us what truly matters. But we can't do it without you. If this story moved you, don't wait. Hit that like button now, and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories to never miss another life-changing tale. Time is fleeting, and these stories of humanity are too important to miss. Comment below with your thoughts, share this video with someone who needs a spark of hope, and join our community of storytellers today. Let's keep the goodness alive together because your support makes all the difference.